What the hell is going on with Britain's spy flights above Gaza? There have been hundreds of those since the genocide begun, and it's not at all clear from the British authorities what's actually going on at all. Now, this is part and parcel, of course, of British and Western complicity in Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. This is the subject of a fascinating new documentary by Declassified, who do incredible and crucial investigative work and have really stuck to this story all the way through very doggedly. The documentary is Britain's Gaza spy flight scandal, which looks into an issue which has just been completely avoided by, I guess, the quote unquote mainstream media in this country. Delighted to be joined by Phil to discuss what the hell is going on with these spy flights. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, Owen. Good, thanks.
Yeah, just to explain, so these are RAF flights from Cyprus, which used to be a British colony. What are they? What are these spy flights? Just basic information, I guess, and how many have there been?
Yeah, so Britain still has this base on Cyprus. It's about 200 miles away from Gaza, and it takes about 45 minutes for these small surveillance planes to go over to Gaza, and they've been spending several hours over there before coming back. They have crew on board, pilot, and then people in the back with all this monitoring, all this surveillance gear that the planes have. They don't just have cameras, they have powerful radars as well that can see through cloud. And they've been gathering thousands of hours of intelligence through these flights, officially looking for hostages and sharing that intelligence with Israel. But the flights have often coincided with major massacres, raising concerns that intelligence they might have shared with Israel could have been used to facilitate some of those war crimes.
So, let's just try and take seriously the official narrative there about trying to locate hostages, Israeli hostages. I'll put it mildly. The Israeli record on retrieving hostages by military means is not good. It's a handful of cases. In one particular case in which they massacred huge numbers of Palestinians to rescue, I think, about 2 or 3 hostages, and they killed far more by military means, by bombing, because they carpet bombed and wiped Gaza off the face of the earth. So what do you make of? I've loaded that one, but what do you make about that official narrative anyway?
Yeah, this is something that's been very puzzling because even from the start of these spy flights, so Grant Shapps, who was the Conservative Defence Secretary, launched them in December 2023, just after the collapse of that first ceasefire that probably many people have forgotten about. But that first ceasefire released a lot of hostages through negotiations and through dialogue. And instead of pressuring the Israelis to try and carry on those negotiations, they seemed to pivot towards doing these spy flights instead that would assist with a militarized approach to rescuing the hostages. And as you said, there have been very few cases where the Israelis actually managed to successfully rescue hostages. We didn't actually go into this in the documentary because we've discussed it in previous films and articles. But there was that case where you said, a number of hostages were released, but hundreds of Palestinians were killed in that operation. Now, there were spy planes over Gaza around that time, before and after that operation, but the governments refused to confirm or deny whether any intelligence from those flights was used to rescue those hostages, or was used in the attacks on civilians at that time as well. So even on their stated claim that this is to rescue hostages, when you actually probe them on that, they don't offer any evidence to say, if it even helped to find any of those hostages at all. Another strange thing was that they continued on days during the subsequent ceasefire when the hostages were being released on live television. So their locations were visible to everyone. And yet the spy flights were continuing on those days. And they even continued after the last British dual national hostage was released, which was also kind of one of the reasons they gave. They weren't just looking for Israeli hostages. Some of them were British. So even after those British ones were released, the flights continued as well. So yeah, there are lots of questions that we've had about that stated rationale, and they've never really given any conclusive evidence as to justify that that's what they're doing. And then there've been all these other concerns about massacres that have happened when spy flights have been in the air, and that's something that we really wanted to investigate in this film.
No, this might sound an obvious question, but I think it's just worth spelling out, because obviously Gaza's airspace, including after the so-called disengagement by Israeli troops in 2005, has been controlled by by Israel, which is why, as per the United Nations, between 2005 and the 7th of October, Gaza was regarded as being under occupation because air, land, sea, all the rest of it, all those that was under control of Israel. In terms of entry and exit, but also the space above it, and also electromagnetic sphere, anything to do with communication, that kind of thing. So, I mean, just again, obvious question. They would obviously have to have the permission, would they not? I mean, how does it work? Do you know about the mechanics of it? Is it kind of every spy flight they have to, the British Army are just there communicating with their Israeli counterparts and coordinating in advance each of the flights, that kind of thing?
So they absolutely did these flights with the full permission of the Israelis. And there was a rare parliamentary committee hearing where some MPs actually probed a little bit and asked ministers about how this was working. And they were saying, if could footage from these flights be used by the Foreign Office to maybe see if war crimes have been committed? And the response the minister gave was, well, if we start doing that, then the Israelis wouldn't give us permission to be in their airspace. So, it was clearly done with full permission of the Israeli authorities.
But I mean, that also makes it sound, if we're just using a bit of logic here, that there would have to be some sort of agreement, a formal agreement with Britain over that, because Britain is a founding member of the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the genocide in Gaza. We don't know if other charges against others, and including further charges against them, because now that's all done in secret, the ICC, following a ruling. But Israel would have to have assurances from Britain that you're members of the International Criminal Court. They will then, there's a potential that the International Criminal Court will request British cooperation, as a member state, including over these spy flights. You'd imagine there would have to be a very explicit formal agreement that they would not give over information to the ICC.
Well, this is another thing that's very strange, because the Ministry of Defence have said that if the ICC asked them for footage, they would give it to them. But it doesn't seem like they've been asked or that they've actually handed over any footage yet. And obviously that stance seems to contradict what the other minister said, where, if they started handing footage over to even other government departments, then the Israelis would seek to shut it all down.
I mean, did they, I'm just wondering that, when the minister said that, I don't know. I mean, MPs are not very good at interrogating these things often, because then it's a case of, well, what is Britain losing from this? Like, is the question, it's just, well, we're helping with the hostages and we can't help with the hostages if we locate the hostages unless we agree not to hand over footage to the ICC. Was that the argument?
I think, yeah, that was their argument, but it was also kind of, at the same time, they weren't showing if they'd made any progress with helping to locate the hostages. And these pilots must have seen, the horrors of Gaza beneath them day after day. Footage of that would almost certainly show at least some war crimes had occurred. So aren't they also obligated to hand that over to the relevant authorities? And I mean, we've seen when the humanitarian aid flights went over Gaza to airdrop aid, and television crews were being prohibited from taking footage of the ground from up in the air, which shows, I think, how nervous the Israelis were about people having an aerial view of the carnage that they'd unleashed in Gaza. So these RAF planes would have had that, in kind of 3D imaging almost. And that's a tremendous archive that they have. And yeah, there's serious questions about, could that be used now to get justice? But also, I think more concerningly, was it used in real time during the battles to help Israel in any way? And this is something that we looked at quite a lot in the documentary, because we spoke to a former RAF technician and we showed him images of the aircraft, in particular this outsourced American aircraft that they started hiring kind of at some point during the whole operation. And that company has put out brochures about the plane's capability. And in there, you can see it has a satellite dish on the roof of the aircraft that can transmit intelligence in real time. It talks about that intelligence being perishable and the importance of sharing that with mission partners as you go, because obviously, intelligence does get less relevant or up to date as time goes on. So he was saying, it seems like the plane, well, the plane certainly has the capability to share that in real time with whoever they wanted to. And there was also this report in the Times newspaper that said it had been shared in real time with Israel.
So what we're talking about there is the very obvious possibility or likelihood that whilst Israel's engaged in what we know a genocide or military campaign, that British planes were transmitting live intelligence to assist them in that so-called military assault.
This is very much the concern. And we looked at a particular massacre where 34 Palestinian civilians were killed in Nuseirat in December last year. So it's just been the 1-year anniversary of that massacre. And the spy flight actually left its location beacon on for almost the whole journey. It's one of, I think, only 3 cases where this has happened. They must have done it by mistake. But that shows it flew within 3 streets of the house that was blown up the next day by Israel. So in that case, it seems like a very direct correlation. And, we're trying to get answers from the MOD about what intelligence was shared with Israel for that massacre.
Keir Starmer made a visit to the Cyprus airbase where these spy flights are launched. That was quite an interesting visit in terms of what he said.
Yes. I mean, you might want to play the tape, but yeah, he said, we're very proud of what you do out here, but we can't necessarily tell the world what that is. And whether he was alluding to the spy flights specifically or other things that they do from that base, it's been used to bomb Yemen as well during the war in Gaza. So there's a lot going on there. But yeah, that did seem like he was trying to rally some of the troops involved in this surveillance operation. And that, that base on Cyprus is on its southern peninsula. So the whole sort of southern tip of Cyprus is still British occupied. You've got this major Air Force base there. And we camped out, in the film you see that we camped out for the whole night to try and see one of these spy planes take off, because what they'd done is, so the RAF started to use this American company to do the flights initially at the same time, and then it became purely the outsourced American plane doing it for the last few months. And after that was exposed that they'd hired this American company, the plane would not turn on its tracker apart from just a very brief squawk or flash when it seemed to turn on. So we went there to see if those flashes that we were seeing on the flight radar website meant the plane was still taking off, or if the surveillance of Gaza had quietly been stopped. But the trouble was these flashes were happening about 3 a.m. in the morning. So we had to stay there all night on this beach, about a mile from the runway, using a really long lens camera. And yeah, finally we saw our colleague in London was watching the flight tracker and told us, okay, it's flashed on now. And then we saw this light come on the runway and we were able just about to film it taking off. So that confirmed the flights were still active. This was in September 2025, after the UN Commission of Inquiry had said that there's a genocide in Gaza. And there's, I think, about over 100 of those flashes on the flight tracking website that we'd seen. So that meant there was 100 more flights than could previously have been confirmed. And the next day in Gaza, after that flight took off, I think around 100 people were killed in airstrikes. Yeah. So again, although we can't directly prove the intelligence was shared from those flights was used by Israel, it again raises serious concerns that it could have been, especially when ministers are being so evasive when we try and ask them questions about this.
Last April 2024, the Israeli military bombed a convoy of the World Central Kitchen, which was distributing food aids to people in Gaza. And they killed several international aid workers and their Palestinian driver. And 3 of the victims were British. Now, can you tell us a bit about the fact one of the fathers of the victims has spoken out calling for the footage to be released?
Yeah, so we went to meet Neil Henderson, whose son Jim was a former Royal Marine, and he was an aid worker in Gaza who was killed in that airstrike. And the family have been trying to get answers about what happened. They've got an inquest coming up, I think, next year that they're trying to get converted into an inquiry that will have more powers to get to the truth. And one of the things that they've been trying to get hold of is footage from an RAF plane that was over Gaza the day their son was killed. This is something that we first revealed at Declassified, that the MOD had this footage and they were refusing to release it to us as journalists through the Freedom of Information Act. And they are also refusing it to give it to even the families of military veterans as well. So yeah, they're demanding that footage is handed over because they think it will give them a fuller picture of the events that happened that day.
It was worth just, again, restating what happened there, just in general terms, because that was coordinated with the Israeli military. It had WCK in massive letters painted on each of the vehicles. They were attacked in quick succession. It wasn't one attack. Each time they were radioing desperately the Israeli authorities to stop them attacking it. I mean, we could go on. The commander in charge, the Israeli commander in charge, had previously written a letter demanding the end of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and the impact of the attack meant that multiple aid agencies said that it was not secure for them to distribute aid in Gaza. It's just worth just emphasizing all of that. I mean, just generally, this puts this in the general context of UK complicity. For example, the provision of crucial components to F-35 jets, which have rained death and destruction on the people of Gaza and played a pivotal role during the genocide. The Arms Trade Treaty of 2014, which Britain enacted into law, makes clear that providing components to the aircraft of states which are thought to be complicit in war crimes and genocide is a violation of that treaty and complicity. So, I mean, this is just part of that general, just, this idea Britain is this kind of like, has taken action. I mean, that's what they keep emphasizing. We've taken these actions and various actions that, including cancelling various, a few arms exports. But, the complicity, the overall complicity in genocide is part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the arms exports I think got a lot of focus in the media when people were willing to kind of call out Britain's role. And obviously there was a sort of some suspensions that Labour put on those in September last year. But the spy flights kind of carried on rumbling away in the background. And I think that showed that really the relationship between Britain and Israel was still very strong in private, and the relationship of the intelligence agencies. And so however much kind of, noise or concern there was about the arms exports, the fact that Britain was potentially a participant in the genocide, sharing real-time surveillance from the battlefield with Israel, that went virtually unchallenged for months.
And just finally, that point about Cyprus that you already raised, because there's a story here about, I guess, British colonialism, the legacy of British colonialism, and that, the continuity, I guess, with the experience of British colonialism. And there's a movement in Cyprus against these bases, which, we would, I think it's quite reasonable to posit in this case, people in Cyprus are legitimately angry that their former colonizer is using bases to, use Cyprus as part of their complicity in genocide.
Absolutely. Ever since Cyprus became supposedly independent from Britain in 1960, there's been resentment at the fact the UK held on to 3% of the island for military purposes. But what we've seen with the genocide in Gaza is that opposition has become much more active. There have been several demonstrations outside the base and also outside the British High Commission in the capital of Cyprus. And in January as well, there was a protest up on Mount Troodos, so the highest point of Cyprus, where the GCHQ, Britain's eavesdropping agency, has this huge golf ball surveillance station up there on the peak of Cyprus. So yeah, there have been a series of protests, and I think that momentum is building there now. It remains to be seen, how far that goes as an election in Cyprus in May, I think, next year. I don't know whether this will feature as a campaign issue for any of the parties. But yeah, I think so. Obviously a lot of people in Britain have been woken up perhaps to the colonial history in Palestine during the genocide. But, there's a kind of interesting parallel with Britain's colonial past and present in Cyprus and how that interacts with what we're seeing in Gaza.
Absolutely. Well, it's a crucial documentary. Do make sure everyone you check it out. We'll include a link in the video description. Britain's Gaza spy flight scandal. Declassified do crucial work, so do check out and support them because they do a lot of the investigative journalism that unfortunately, mainstream media outlets refuse to do. And they've done crucial work during Israel's genocide, but their work obviously extends beyond that. But it's obviously of historic importance. So share the video for us to like, subscribe, leave your thoughts, leave your comments. But honestly, Phil, really appreciate it and well done.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks for having me on the show.